Great. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this very exciting panel we have on a more equitable energy transition and the transformation of the resources industry, which is a very vital topic to talk about today. I'm joined by two dear friends, Mark Cutifani and Florence Drummond. Mark is, amongst many things, board chair for Vale Base Minerals, and Florence, also amongst many things, executive director of the Development Partner Institute. Before we get into our conversation, just some opening remarks. First, I'd like to thank Razil for the invitation for us to participate in this event, which is absolutely fabulous, to honor the memory of Liam, and also to the university for supporting this whole program, which I think is really important for young people. A true honor, and I know I'm speaking for Mark and Florence when I say this. I'd just like to provide some context for our discussion. And why this is important for young people, particularly those, which is most based on my own children, that are concerned about both climate change, fairness and prosperity, and growing prosperity for all humanity. I think firstly is the realization that I think is starting to dawn on most of the world is that we're shifting from a fossil fuel-based energy system to one that's minerals-based. And along with that, there's an assumption that the supply of minerals, things like copper, nickel, lithium, are provided in an affordable, accessible, and secure supply. But most importantly, that by the mining industry are responsibly extracted and processed. So it's within that context that mining is actually a very critical element of not just only the energy transition, but prosperity as we know it across many sectors. And when we talk about an equitable transition, what does that mean? It's really a play on the words of a just transition, which I'm a big advocate for, which is a set of principles and approaches that really are about co-creation by all stakeholders of a shared roadmap, but really is to ensure that the burdens of the transition are not borne by those that can't bear that burden, and that the value and benefits of the transition aren't captured by a chosen few. And interestingly, only 2 countries have adopted this approach as a matter of policy in the government, and that's my home country of New Zealand and Iceland. And interestingly, both had female prime ministers when they adopted that. So I think there's maybe a correlation there. And interestingly, these are the same core principles that are embodied in the Development Partner Institute's Development Partner Framework. So the industry faces tremendous challenges, both technically and from a sustainability and social perspective. And this is our discussion. And, why do we need young people? Why do you need to care? So one is obviously this is very critical, but I think young people bring a clarity of thinking that's unencumbered by current paradigms that help drive the mining industry. So when you bring that clarity of thinking, I think it's fundamental to be able to drive the transformation that is necessary for the industry. So with those kind of opening remarks, what I'm going to do is jump into a whole bunch of discussion now with Florence and Mark. So first, Florence, it's going to go over to you. So, Flo obviously is an Indigenous leader, and Mark obviously is a mining industry leader. Sometimes we may think of equitable differently. So maybe just to level set. So Florence, starting with you, what does equitable actually mean to you when I say that word?
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, everyone. And as a Dara Wutati woman, I acknowledge Wadan Dibuja in the country in which I am speaking and joining you all from. That's in southwest not Queensland, but WA, which is the Margaret River region. So for me, equity as an Indigenous woman has always been understanding and having a seat at the table with my own personal history and my own personal life. Understanding what equity means at the first point has always been something that I've been trying to understand in the context of every industry, and now in mining over the past 10 years, really understanding what that means to not only Indigenous people here in Australia, but globally. And yes, definitely our seat at the table and having a voice there to also be heard, but also to speak is something that's very important. And I think as I've learned over the past 10 years, that equity piece is making sure that we're there to communicate as well, to make sure that we all understand what these terms of participation means and engagement means. So it's very contextual, but I really look forward to talking about that more, Peter, as we continue this conversation.
Great, Flo. Fantastic response, actually, and it'll lead into some other questions as well. Thank you. So, Mark, over to you as a long-time and very progressive leader in the mining industry. So what does equitable mean to you?
Well, Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Florence, for the introduction as well. If I strip it down to what I see as the bare essentials, I think firstly, everyone has to have a voice. And in many cases, voices that should be heard are either ignored or at least neglected. And I think the important thing and why I think the debate has to change, for too long we've ignored voices. And in our industry, somebody that doesn't agree with us or people that don't agree with us, we tend to ignore. And I think that's wrong. And clearly, as an industry, we have to think and deal with voices very differently. We have to engage. And in particular, we have to engage with those that see the world very differently to ourselves and try and find common ground. That's the first point. So, one, everyone has a voice. Two, burdens need to be shared. And in taking that point, it is quite often that local communities share or actually take the greatest burden. And we all forget that, including us as industry leaders, including governments and other leaders in society. We tend to leave the local communities either defend for themselves or try and defend a position with the mining company, when at the end of the day, it's a much broader community and social responsibility. So burdens have to be shared. And third point, responsibility is shared as well, because at the end of the day, we are short the minerals we need to navigate the energy transition. So we are going to have to access some materials that people might not otherwise want to see mined or secured. And so how do we balance that shared burden and that shared responsibility? Because that represents the two sides of the discussion, and I think they have to be equally represented.
No, great. Thanks, Mark. And really two interesting, overlapping, but different perspectives. And I will ask one question before we jump into the next area is, this issue around having a voice and making sure everyone's at the table is, and we've often talked about, we speak two different languages, particularly in the context of Indigenous communities and even, non-Indigenous communities in the mining industry. And I always say, and we've had discussions around how do we bridge that, because mining companies tend to talk in a technocrat language. And I always say Indigenous people speak in the language of humans and in stories. And it's hard to get understanding when you're actually almost talking at cross purposes to each other. How do we overcome? I'm interested in just your perspectives on how we overcome that, because I think it's a big issue. And how do we get to a common language so we can begin understanding each other? So, Flo, do you want to tackle that? And then Mark, maybe?
Yeah, sure. And this isn't a new problem as well, Peter, and we know this, mining's been happening for a very long time across different continents as well. And we have mining leaders who cross these continents. So throughout their career, they cross from different regions. So the practice, yes, it might be contextual to the region, but in application, it shouldn't be left behind in that region and not brought over to another place. And this is what I find here in Australia. We have many global leaders who move their careers to Australia or come back to Australia. And sometimes they forget that they can apply the same great practices that they do overseas to here in Australia. So I think that for me has been my growing concern, is that this is not a new problem. So why aren't we taking these lessons that we've already learned, these conversations we've already had, and actually applying them? So that's my challenge at the moment. So opening that dialogue as well and accountability at that level, but then making sure that there's a lot more education around, there is already a lot of education out there. It's about how do we then continue to make sure that it's relevant and it's strong, it's progressive, and it's inclusive.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mark, representing the technocrat side of the discussion.
Well, I would hope I'm also representing the social side of the discussion as well, but maybe a slightly different perspective. But look, firstly, two words, values and beliefs.
Yeah.
In all of these conversations, and doesn't matter who it's between, we have to make sure that we're paying appropriate respect to people's values and beliefs. As a mining industry representative, I would point out that mining started with human existence, 450 BC.
Yep.
4 words define the nature of things: air, water, fire, and earth. In today's terms, that'd be air, water, energy, and minerals. And the ancient Greeks understood that they needed minerals for everything. And that hasn't changed today, whether it's to produce food, just to actually purify water, to bring deserts to life. Literally everything we use is either made of minerals or has been made by the products of minerals. So it is part of everything. The question is, how do we pay appropriate respect to all of our stakeholders in making sure that when we access minerals to make life possible on the planet, we do it in a way that's respectful to their needs, their values, their beliefs. And whether it's the faith-based conversations, whether it's a local community, or it's with Indigenous or First Nations peoples, the conversation has to be respectful of their values and beliefs, and how do we find solutions that work for all. And it's a tough piece to navigate, but it's becoming increasingly more important to the future of the world.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Flo. Yeah, and I think two key points here is one, respect for everyone's belief and values and understanding those. And Florence, I think, Flo, you made a great point about, this is nothing new. What can we learn from the past? It doesn't, and the gap sometimes seems to be widening, not narrowing. I just want to, you both talked about kind of respect, and Florence, you hit a keyword, participation. You kind of dropped that in the middle of a sentence. So Matthew Kuhn-Cum, who has stepped down but was the Grand Chief of the Cree Nation in Canada, was on the board of DPO. And I remember once he said to me, Peter, we find the word consultation insulting. We don't want consultation, we want participation. So I thought that was a really powerful quote, and and something that really deserves to be unpacked, actually, because what does participation actually mean? Because consultation is one way. Ask you, this is what I'm going to do. What do you think? Great, bye. Whereas participation is a much bigger tent. So Flo, again, start with you. Is when Matthew said that, and obviously you're in all these discussions, with various Indigenous First Nations groups, what does that actually mean? When we say the word participation, what do you think we're talking about here?
Yeah, and I think, with this age-old problem as well, participation has never been where Indigenous peoples have real, true, active participation in the conversation. I think if we understand the value chain better, if we're talking about this now and unpacking this now, we've always been a little bit more down the way of participation, where we should be at the table at the very beginning in terms of negotiations, license to operate, like true participation there. And not just being there just to be to speak, but to also be listened to, and then those words incorporated. And I think that's a really important element, that these the participation is actually valued, that the words are incorporated into what the agreements are moving into the future, and so that then equals respect, equals trust, equals a successful partnership. So I think that should ideally be what the cycle should be, but at this moment we're still knocking at the door to be let in, and I think that's where the problem is. But definitely in with First Nations Major Projects Coalition, I really find that's a fantastic example of what equity partnerships are in true life, which is a great example globally. So really looking forward to many more of those stories coming to life around the globe as well. And of course, I do understand local context with regional governance and politics and all those types of things that are impactful to how the results should be, but definitely there are best place practices out there for us to actually look at. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Flo. And Mark, you've been a leader in the mining industry on this for 10, 20 years. You've done some great work in South Africa at Anglo American with the Impact Catalyst, Peru with Corveco, a lot of great examples. So when you look at this moving from consultation to participation, what do you think from the perspective of the mining industry?
Well, first thing I would say is the word consultation, I think, is patronising.
Yes.
In that it presumes in some people's mind that as long as we talk to people, we can do what we like.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good thing that we're throwing it in the dustbin.
Yep.
I think it is about co-creation. When Anglo developed the collaborative regional development, where we work with other companies, we work with the government, but most importantly, we worked with local communities in designing how infrastructure would be developed so that it could support mines that are already in place. But how could we put the infrastructure and construct it in a way where local communities got the benefit needed everybody around the table, and we designed the solutions together. Not perfect, but we're all equal players around the table working out what worked for everybody. So I think it's a co-creation. And remember that word, Peter, back in 2011 and 12, when we first formed the Development Partner Institute, that co-creation was a foundation that we built the organisation on. And I think today it's even more important and more powerful. And Florence has captured that in her descriptions, I think, very capably as well. So I think it's about co-creation and doing this together.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, Mark. Yeah, and then, Sheila, who's also on our board, often talks about, the complexity of that being speaking truth to power, right? How do you create an environment that when people that, don't have the power in the room, whether it be governments or companies, can speak their truth? And I think that's kind of and that gets to this kind of everybody needs to be in the room, that co-creation. So any comments just on that truth to power concept, particularly from Florence? Yeah, just because I think this is a really important issue.
Oh, I absolutely love that. And I think that's very scary as well for people who traditionally have or use that power imbalance or have had used that power imbalance. So I think for me, I'm really looking forward to activating that more so in my time with DPI and moving forward in those conversations, because I think that there's a lot of those elements that we can definitely work with. I was thinking before when you're talking, Mark, around the element of equitability as well, and those words around participation and what Anglo has been doing. So the element of time through projects as well. How do we measure that? How do we make sure that now, through the rush of the energy transition, that element of time, we still take time for dialogue, we still take time for respect, we still take time to build trust? I think that's the biggest risk here with the rush towards the energy transition.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So one last question this here before we jump over is FPIC. Obviously, a lot of companies, and I think also communities, and people talk about, free and prior informed consent, right? Which I always think sits under consultation. But, again, Mark Podlasly has talked about that's actually a minimum bar. So this is not what we should aspire to. It's the lowest level of performance that we should aspire to. In fact, we should be greater. So I'm kind of interested, Mark, maybe from your perspective, because the mining industry is the one that talks about this a lot, and other industries as well, with FPIC, as they call it. Do you think that should be a minimum bar of performance for a company, irrespective of jurisdiction that we're working in?
You have to go beyond free, prior, informed consent. The principle, I think, is absolutely critical. And I remember when, as an industry, a number of us went to the Vatican to talk to the Global Church Synod, and we were trying to understand, because in many communities in which we move into, particularly in Africa and South America, quite often no government infrastructure, no business infrastructure or organisation, and the community infrastructure is spread, but there's always a church. And so I said, one of the ways to get to a community and try and understand where they're coming from in those locations is to start with the church, because their convening power, bringing communities together, is very powerful, and engaging and understanding what that community is looking for in terms of its future. Where does it want to be 5, 10, 20 years? And the question we have to be able to answer is, how can we help you get there?
Yeah.
And if you start with that conversation, if you remember in New York, Peter, that concept of engaging with communities about the future they want to create scared a lot of people from not only our industry, from lots of other industries as well. Yeah. And we made the point that if the community doesn't want you there, you've really got to question whether you can be there. And to a shareholder who said, "What's this ESG stuff?" I said, well, let me explain from a social perspective. If you're building a mine and the community doesn't want you there, you can add 30 to 40% to the costs, and in all likelihood, it's not going to be economic anyway.
Yeah.
So it's in your interest to work out how to do it in an appropriate and sensitive way. Yeah. And that's my experience after 46 years. Yeah. In all likelihood, if you can't get there in a collaborative way, it's going to make it extremely difficult if you try and force it. So why would you?
Yeah. And Mark, I think it's really important that you've connected because, we always say, ESG and financial performance is not an or, it's an and. And I think your connection of strong social performance is actually a value add, because if you don't get it right, it's a significant cost burden. So I think that connection is really important. Just switching now to kind of a dual topic of past performance and prior agreements. So we've got a great question, actually, which I'm going to integrate into this next area of discussion, which is a combination of first prior agreements. So we have these situations where agreements may be in place that are decades old, and then a mining company does an action that, whilst legal under that agreement that's 20, 30 years old, is in fact illegal under current law, okay? Or even if it is legal, it's just not the right thing to do anymore, just because it was done 20, 30 years ago. So what should a company do in those circumstances? I just want to add another twist into this. How do we address historic injustices linked to mining, either in that mine site itself or for the industry in general? So whether environmental or economic. So I'd like to thank the person that posed that question. So I've got to hit the approve button on that. So I'll open that up to you, Mark, first. So prior agreements and performance under those, and two, within that context, historical injustices that may have occurred either within that region or within the specific mine, just because of its age.
Yeah, first thing I would say about agreements, even agreements, let's say agreements 30 years ago versus agreements today versus agreements in 30 years' time. The agreements and the alignments that we can achieve today will likely be out of time, or maybe not appropriate in 5 years' time. Okay. They need to be living things. The real issue is building trust with the community. I'll take it to an economic issue, because I don't want to point to a specific agreement. But when Anglo-American relocated to London, there were a range of agreements that the South African government imposed that the company thought were unfair. And we made the point, or they made the point 20 years ago, how difficult they were. And it was interesting, in the last 10 years, we stopped arguing and said, okay, you understand our position. We then focused on our own behaviours and building trust with the communities, with government officials, and with all of the people that we came into contact with. And it was interesting, about 6 or 7 years after we had really changed our own approach and said, let's build those relationships and let our behaviours speak for who we are. The government came to us and said, we want to change those agreements, and we actually accept that what was in place that time didn't work for us today. And they changed it, not because they felt an immediate need to go and change, but because they saw our behaviour was actually consistent with what they wanted to see, and therefore it was time to modernise and change the nature of the relationship. It goes both ways. Yeah. And I'm giving an example of a government making a change because they saw us behave in a different way to the community and to people more generally. And that's the nature of the agreements, I think, that we build in these circumstances. And I remember Rio Tinto 30 years ago, and how the relationships in Western Australia were breakthrough. Yeah. But those relationships have to keep evolving and improving, and the sensitivity on issues change. And I think, to be fair, they are starting to recognise the importance of that evolution, talking to Jacob and those guys, that they know they've got a long way to go and they've got to keep evolving. And I think that's the nature of the relationships. They have to evolve and reflect our own views and the views of our constituents both ways.
Yeah, no, I think, Mark, a really important point around it's through behaviour that we can change things, even agreements, versus having two lawyers talking to each other about what it should be. Flo, I know this is a topic dear to your heart, given some of the incidents in WA with caves and shelters that are important, if not sacred.
And I didn't mean to set Flo up for that conversation. Flo.
No, that was a nice tee up.
I'm not ready,
Flo, what do you
Mark.
think?
I was going to start with that. I was definitely going to start with that. So definitely, you know, yes, absolutely here in Australia, acknowledging the Juukan Gorge incident that happened a couple of years ago, which really changed the mining world in this decade. I believe that very truly. And again, you know, that's not the first time these things have happened. And so what I really think about around that is again the context of why this happened, but again the internal education and who is responsible or who's safeguarding these decisions as well. So when with my Wimmera hat on, Indigenous women in mining, what we really found with all of our women that were in the network is we found that a lot of our support systems internally, there were no Indigenous people in Indigenous positions. And that was a really big risk for us as internal participants, as internal employees, to feel culturally safe, firstly, to feel that we could be heard as an employee, but also if you're reflecting back then into what their roles are and what their decision making within their roles, there's no sense of urgency around lived experience to what's truly culturally important, and making sure that that element is being pushed within any agreement or conversation. So I think for us, that was a huge thing that we identified. And one thing that we really were vocal about, that Indigenous people need to be Indigenous positions within mining companies, because they're big, rigid beasts and they move slowly, but they need to be continually informed, like Mark said, contextual, with strong relationships and with trust as well. So I think there's that disconnection between what happens internally and then how that links out externally as well. So great question, whoever said that. Amazing. Love it.
Yeah, no, Flo, and I love three things you just connected there. One is, what is the internal adjudication process inside a mining company, which is really interesting, and how it's devolved. How can people feel culturally safe within an organization, even given that? And then three is, you know, having more Indigenous people in the roles where you're dealing with Indigenous matters, because, you know, as evolved as we like to think we are that are non-Indigenous, there's nothing quite like having the person closest to that being involved and having responsibility in companies. So fantastic. There's a really challenging question that doesn't fit in any of the themes, but I thought I'll roll it out anyway. So I'll read this question, and one of you can volunteer first. Just last week, an Indigenous woman in British Columbia working at a mine told me that she disagrees with everything that mining does, but she needs to feed her kids and still benefits from local employment. This might be common across the industry, but it's very concerning. How do we bridge this gap? I think this is a great question, right? Yeah, working in an industry I totally disagree with because I need to make ends meet. I mean, wow.
It's a fantastic question. And Mark, if I may, as an Indigenous woman myself from mining.
Yeah, you've been there, Flo. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I still am there, right? Really. So I think for me, one of the why I entered mining is because of the same reasons, because then I can have the affordability to pay for my bills, my healthcare, all those types of things. And this is what we find as well as women, we have to care for our families on a cultural, like our cultural priority to care for our family is quite high. And so we will do what we need to do to make sure that we can meet that obligation. And if it means to also be working in an industry that doesn't fit with us or sit with us culturally straight first, but that's the only option because we live in a community and that's the only jobs that we can access. And of course, then we have to feed our family. That's the main thing. And so for us, the way that I've dealt with it is to make sure that whilst I'm in there internally, that we're also supporting each other and also having that two-way dialogue with people around other elements that challenge us in terms of social challenges, in terms of participation out in society, in terms of racism, in terms of all these other things that we're challenged with. So I think there is a leverage point there, and there is a huge sacrifice, but I think caring for our families is definitely one of our first priorities that we can't really ignore.
Yeah, no, that's great, Flo. And yeah, difficult choices are made within that context. Yeah, Mark, any kind of reflections?
Yeah, it's one of those. It's a really important question, and it's hard not to answer it without sounding a bit like a lecture. So I'll try and make it unlecturish.
Unlecturish, yeah.
Yeah. Now, and I'll try and not throw too many numbers on the table, and I don't want to do that, but. If I without fertilizers, we can only feed 4 billion people on the planet. That is, 4 billion people would not survive. First point, fact. Without minerals supporting energy, we wouldn't have the heat to keep people warm in the cold.
Yep.
On the scale. So people say, well, wait a minute, I can live here and I can do okay, but we're talking about 8 billion people. And I'm the chairman of Paranutrition. People are starving because we can't get them food, or they don't have access to fertilizers, or they don't have access to water, or they don't have access to the things they need to feed themselves, to shelter, to provide education for their children. That's what minerals bring to the planet for 8 billion people. If we weren't mining, then we couldn't support 8 billion people on the planet. And if you look at human footprint today, 40% of the earth is dedicated to agriculture to feed people. 10% of the 40, that's 25% of it, is for crops. Without fertilizers, we'd need another 10%. So we'd actually have to sterilize more areas to feed people at 8 billion. 15% of the Earth's surface is dedicated to urbanization, cities. If we weren't able to build up, we'd have to build out. And that would be another 15% of the planet sterilized, more biodiversity lost. Between urban landscapes and agriculture, we take up 55% of the Earth's surface. It's a massive number. It would be 80% without the mineral products. And you know how much ground we take up in mining?
Yep.
0.3%.
Yep.
Now, when you look at a mine, it's concentrated because we're mining a concentrated series of minerals that can be used all over the world to actually change the dynamics. And yep, it is invasive. And we don't, in my view, look after the people that are living close to those activities. Therefore, I don't think it's equitable. We go back to the first question. But without mining, we don't survive, or we don't survive at 8 billion people. And the ancient Greeks understood that in 450 BC with their 4 words. It's not as obvious to many people because they're not thinking about the whole. But that's what we have to think about. And we have to do what we do better. But without mining, the world as we know it is not possible. And it's not possible for 8 billion people. And that's a simple fact.
So, Mark, thank you for that passionate display. I think there's 2 dimensions to this in my mind. One is, I think, and to help these people, anybody that's working in industry that they may feel they don't agree with, I think there's 2 dimensions to this, actually. One is, what's the importance of mining and minerals to society, which you've aptly described, Mark. And then you scratched on, I think, the second part, which is that we need to do better at how we do it, right? So we can agree. So you got 1, do I agree with the industry? Yes. And then 2, do I agree how the industry behaves? And I think this gets to 2 aspects, which ICMM talks about, which is the pinnacle mining body, which is the mining industry needs to become nature net positive. I actually say the mining industry needs to become economically net positive in the region, environmentally net positive, and socially net positive. And that actually challenges the industry, I think, to perform beyond any legal requirements set in the country. I think a bar of performance for the industry has to be set beyond any legal requirement, even the highest, whether that be Australia or Canada, and get away from that's what I need to do based on the legal requirements in these countries. So, and I know that's a moving target. That's kind of a provocation. So yeah, Mark, comment on that.
Yeah, just a simple point. I think we already are net positive environmentally. Okay. Because of the net footprint reduction that we have against human activities, the use of our materials to purify water, to bring water to deserts, to create all those things.
When you look at the whole value chain.
We don't. Yeah, exactly. And the circular economy, we can recycle more. We can do so many things much better. And I think people should be holding us to a higher standard. But in terms of net contribution, I think we're overwhelmingly positive, but we haven't done a very good job explaining why that is the case.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So just very specifically, because the question hasn't gone away, so I'll answer specifically, is this, they said responsibilities and burdens being shared sounds like a really fair approach, but how do we address these historic injustices that have been linked to extraction, whether it be environmental or economic? How do we acknowledge those without that, I think, in my view, cluttering what we do going forward? Because I think we sometimes can get too wrapped up in the past. We need to learn from it to go forward, but not get too locked into doing the, just ruminating on the past. So maybe Flo, I'll throw that one to you since
Yeah,
dear to you.
yeah, definitely. Thank you, Peter. And I think with that was that one as well, in terms of participation to then addressing historical injustices. What we've seen and what I'm really excited about is that as an employee from within the industry, I've then built my capacity to be a much more capable business owner, and etc. I think where the drive is for us to change things internally and locally is as local Indigenous people, and we see that here in Australia and then up in Canada as well, that people from within the industry or within these communities have built the capacity to then become bigger businesses within the industry, within the community. Therefore, then addressing some of the challenges, the social challenges that they have, the infrastructure challenges that they have that are a result of historical injustices, if that makes sense. So then having that economic position to much more fully participate within the local economy to make decisions equally at the table, that then starts to address that intergenerational or past generational change. Historically, we cannot change anything that has happened to us personally, but we can make our lives better by building our economic strength and by providing better healthcare for our families and our children to then make sure that we're healthier. We can participate better. We can go to university or any of these other things, or be active business owners as well. So I think from that's how I've chosen to address these injustices. And I know many of the people around me, being Indigenous people, are addressing them actively every day.
No, great, Flo. Yeah, that's a great answer and response. And Mark, I know, again, the Impact Catalyst is one example, but, beyond what companies doing, how do you think about this from a personal perspective and what you've done?
Firstly, I'm aware of, and Canada actually has a very strong focus on restorative justice. And it's a tough question in terms of how you do this in a fair way, because in some cases the damage was done many generations prior, right up to the last generation. And I think that becomes one for society to work on and develop models for how it can be done. Now, in South Africa, I would say it's by far a long way from a perfect system, but what South Africa tried to do with the Black economic empowerment was trying to address the issues of apartheid, generations of apartheid. And it creates its own problems, and it in some ways reduces new investment that actually is part of the solution. So how do you get a balance where everyone in society recognises the past injustices, and we all play our part, including our industry, as part of a societal response? And that's where I think governments and political leaders have to help us find solutions that work on a broad basis. Because if you say to one industry, okay, you've got to address that issue, then you don't get the investment, you don't get the new possibilities emerging with new models. And so it sort of spirals backwards. So how do you get that balance? And I think that's one in society, and each industry and all of us have to play a part in dealing with those types of issues. And in some cases, it's very direct and obvious legacies that have to be corrected, but it's a much broader issue, and it goes to crime, and it goes to a whole range of other social issues that need to be dealt with in a more constructive way through society. And I think we're part of that. We should be part of that dialogue.
Yeah, no, Mark, great. And I think a key point in that answer, that your response there was, we're not going to be able to get the money. And I think, the capital shortfall in mining is quite significant. And I think a couple of points there is, obviously, we need to scale up mining in a way that's been unprecedented in terms of, doubling copper production, for example, in the next, 15 years. And capital doesn't really like some of the aspects of mining that you've touched on unless we address these issues. And Mike Henry, the CEO of BHP at the IEA Critical Minerals last week, mentioned that for copper production to meet the demands of the energy transition needs capital of close to $200 billion worth of capital, and only 50 is being deployed. That's $150 billion shortfall that we've got. And that capital is only going to come, Mark and Flo, if we address the things like what we're talking about. Otherwise, capital will not flow in, and that creates problems for the energy transition. So there's a big connection there. There's a question here actually from Razil. Thank you, Razil. A shortfall for critical minerals is likely. The price of metals will go up. will this mean that just the rich countries will be able to afford a green transition and enjoy a cleaner environment? So is this an equitable, is there a equitable transition issue then for poorer countries as a result of this? An interesting question. That's a mind bender.
Florence, you want me to start with this one, Florence?
Yeah, Mark, why don't you go first?
You go, Mark. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
It's a problem.
Yeah.
Let's not beat around the bush. What we've seen, whether it be through COVID and other issues, where in the end, economic capacity to afford things that others can't afford tends to see the more developed countries or the more wealthy countries do better. And I think that's a real issue. I'd like to think that in those countries that do have natural resources, where those natural resources can be developed and that the broader society benefits as a consequence, and that requires governance, and there's a whole range of papers around, and I was talking to Elizabeth McPhail, Christine McPhail, regarding her paper around those countries that have benefited from their resource. So let's see if we could create a resource benefit as opposed to a resource curse, which is about governance and taking the revenues from resources for those countries that do have them, and they invest in new infrastructure, in particular social infrastructure, that benefits the countries for the next 50 years. And that whole strategy, I think, is really important. But it's going to be a problem. We've got to think about how to deal with that and how we help those countries, particularly as miners, where we're developing. What can we do to help those countries deploy their resources in a different way? And in fact, in retiring from Anglo, I've been working on minerals and mineral resource endowments, infrastructure, and how we might look at funding infrastructure in a different way so that there's a broader community benefit. And then there's the energy transition. So how do we invest in renewables and other things that all connect, and resources becomes a catalyst for a much more progressive and effective development of infrastructure for broader community benefit. That's a key in my view, and I think we need to do a lot of that work. Or exactly as Raziel says, we're going to have that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of the rich get richer.
Exactly.
And that's not where we want to be.
Yeah, and Mark, you've got two dimensions to that, and then Flo, I'll get you to any editorial comments on that. So there's two dimensions to this one. One is the one you've described very well, which is how do we use the wealth from mining to build better infrastructure, whether it be social, economic, that really allows the prosperity of the communities and the regions and countries to grow beyond the life of mine, right? Develop other industries. And you've been fantastic with the work at Anglo. And the other one dimension is actually helping countries capture more of the downstream value of their minerals, right? And move from this extract ship model to doing more with the minerals in country, which builds the wealth, right? So I think it's exciting. Sorry, Flo, I'm going to cut you off because we've got to fight. I just got the 5-minute warning, and I do want to cover a really important topic. I thought I had 19 minutes because that's what one system is telling me, but trust. We know everything we've talked about is a foundation on trust. And we know through latest Edelman work that mining industry has the lowest trust of any sector on the planet right now. ICMM's, interestingly, leadership forum next week in London, which I'm speaking at. The theme is trust. And we know trust between companies, communities, and governments is really important. How do we go about, because without everything we're saying is kind of at naught if we can't trust each other, how do we go about rebuilding and then maintaining this trust? And Flo, ask you first, because I know you're very passionate about this. How do we go about this?
Yeah, well, we need to talk to each other, right? I don't think we talk to each other enough. So multi-stakeholder dialogue is the first step to building trust, because that's when we can understand what our positions are, what our issues are, what our challenges are, and also what the opportunities to improve are. So I think that for me is the biggest thing, is to talk to each other, to build out and to understand how we move forward. So I'll stay that one point.
Cool. Mark, your thoughts. How do we go about this?
I think we have to engage our most critical observers in open dialogue and talk about the issues in a constructive way. What we tend to do, and I'm not saying everybody in the industry, but what we've tended to do is talk to ourselves about the good work we're doing and we tended not to want to talk to NGOs and others that are quite critical. And I think they're the most important people to engage, those that are most critical of the industry, to try and understand their perspectives, what we're not doing right, how do we engage. And we need to understand that it's a long conversation. It's about building trust. It's not one conversation. It's an engagement that lasts forever.
Yeah.
And until we demonstrate that we're committed to those conversations for the long term and changing as we learn more about ourselves from others, that will create the relationships that help create the right answers for our industry and more broadly for society as a whole.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, the challenge we face is obviously this is operating in a world where I think trust in institutions and many other things is at its lowest ever, and where people don't actually speak to each other. So it's not a common thing. Mark, hand up, yes.
I used to go every year. I used to go to the alternate in Darba,
yes,
in Cape Town.
Yeah,
I was the only CEO that would go, and for the first half hour, I'd be hammered, and for the second half hour, I got to say a few words. But at the end, I always got a standing ovation. Not because of what I said, but because I was there.
Yeah, exactly. Just turning up sometimes is half the game.
We have to be there and we have to engage, and people have to see change as a consequence. Those little things are so symbolic and so powerful.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, in the environment that we're in and we're at and where we need to go, I think this is going to take real courageous and bold leadership from the industry, but also from other stakeholders, government and Indigenous communities. We need to set aside prejudices and biases and kind of paradigms that we hold to be true and just be open. And I always say this is about relationship building. And it amazes me that we think building relationships in business is different to what we do in personal relationships. Personal relationships is all about dialogue, transparency, honesty. This is what we've got to practice actually here, but do it in a whole new approach and fashion. So I know we're winding down the clock. Florence, one last takeaway for young people, because we want young people to be engaged. We want their new thinking, because they're going to be the agents of change, I believe. So with that, Florence, one last takeaway, and then you, Mark, as well.
Absolutely. For me, it is show up, actually. So show up to many conversations, to listen and to learn. So that's my biggest takeaway for young people out there, to show up.
Great. Thanks, Flo. Mark?
We need young people to lead the most important industry on the face of the planet.
Thank you.
We want you. We need you.
Great. I think those are great two insights. So Mark and Flo, as always, thank you both so much for participating today. A rich conversation. I know you and I, the three of us, could go on for hours, and look forward to seeing you both in London next week. So again, thank you. And Raziel, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this amazing forum. Thanks, guys.
Sure.